Bonsoir à tous. Son Excellence Monsieur Fautrier, ministre plénipotentiaire, Son Excellence Monsieur Pastorelli, chers amis, ce soir notre invité à la Monaco Méditerranée Foundation est Madame Antonella Caruso. Madame Caruso est une grande experte du monde arabe. Elle est diplômée en langue et littérature arabe à l'Université Sapienza de Rome. De 2008 à 2012, elle organise et dirige un dialogue sur la réconciliation nationale durant la guerre civile à Bagdad. De 2005 à 2007, elle collabore avec l'Institut Montaigne à Paris et publie une recherche sur la présence de l'islam en Europe. Le titre de cette recherche est « Au nom de l'islam ». En 2012, elle est directeure de The Middle East and West Asian Division au département des affaires politiques des Nations Unies à New York. Elle croit fermement en l'importance de la connaissance pour faire le bien dans le monde. Elle collabore aujourd'hui encore avec de nombreux journaux. Cette conférence sera en anglais avec traduction simultanée. Tous ceux qui le souhaitent devraient avoir un écouteur. Le titre de notre conférence, Moyen-Orient, une paix est-elle possible? Antonella va analyser pour nous les obstacles et les opportunités pour une paix durable au Moyen-Orient. Je lui passe la parole. Veuillez lui souhaiter la bienvenue avec moi.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, j'espère que vous m'entendez bien. Je ne parlerai pas français, malheureusement, parce que je me sens un tout petit peu plus à l'aise en parlant en anglais. But I would like to thank the Monaco Mediterranean Foundation for organizing this amazing gathering here in Monaco. And I would love to thank Cassandra for her kind words, lovely introduction, and obviously for inviting me to discuss with you, I hope, at the end of my speech, a possible or an impossible peace in the Middle East. But before I start answering this impossible question, I would love just to briefly define what it is the Middle East and what I mean for peace. The Middle East is this vast area that goes from West Egypt to East Iran by land and by sea from the southern and eastern Mediterranean shores to the Persian Gulf, crossing the Red Sea. It's an area which is incredibly diverse in terms of political systems and levels of economic development, but with a unique cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity. But it is also a geopolitical area where international, regional, and civil wars have been fought in the last quarter of a century, leaving behind fragmented societies, weak or failed states, and armed, non-state actors and militias. What is peace? Peace is, politically speaking, the absence of disorder in international relations or of civil unrest in a given country. Peace can be narrow-based and limited to truce, ceasefires, power-sharing agreements between or among the parties in conflict. But this narrow-based concept of peace doesn't tackle, the deep-rooted causes of conflict, and tensions usually resurface. But there is also a broad concept of peace, which is more stable, and it's the one that is based on political negotiations, political dialogues, diplomacy, meant to solve the deep root causes of conflicts following the signature of a peace treaty. But peace is ultimately the political objective of wars. Peace is the creation of a new order that is better than the previous one. But in order to achieve this peace, the objectives of war had to be well-defined, hopefully, and achievable. Because if they're too ambitious or ill-conceived, unfortunately, peace tends to be less reachable and wars tend to be endless. So now let's go back to the Middle East, and definitely the area where actually, war continues to be a feature of this area because of not only the latest war in Gaza, but also the continuation of low-intensity civil wars in Syria as well as in Yemen. It's not to speak about the very complex situation still in Iraq. And this at the time of American gradual disengagement from the region and increasing regional competition. So we cannot talk about peace if we don't deal with wars. And so the Middle East gives us a list. We have the Israel-Palestine war. We have the Israeli regional war against the so-called pro-axis of evil for Israel and the Western press, but for resistance for the Arab press, namely the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the factions, the so-called factions, is these armed Shia groups, that operate in Iraq and lately became famous because it attacked diplomatic and military targets of the US presence in Iraq. But then I would like to turn your attention to the very complex geopolitical situation in Syria, and finally to Iraq and Iran. It is a long list. It is probably too much to process, but please bear with me. So the Israel-Palestine war is by definition an endless war. Two different nationalisms, the Israeli and the Palestinian ones, have developed in parallel over the years, claiming control over the same territory. The famous slogan, from the river to the sea, meaning from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea, unfortunately has appealed to both. However, this endless war started as a state-centric conflict between Israel from one side and a group of Arab states, namely Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, on the other, in 1948, soon after the Israeli Declaration of Independence. 3 more wars will be fought since then between Israel and the above-mentioned Arab states. But it's the 1967 war. It's definitely really the most dramatic event in the region because it is a humiliating defeat for the Arab states. And Israel ended up occupying the Sinai, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. After the great and the last Arab-Israeli war in 1973, the conflict became an asymmetric conflict between a state, Israel, and no-state actors, namely the PLO first, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Hamas later. The PLO has been and is the only officially recognized representative of the Palestinian people. Hamas lacks this definition, but it has a very nasty one instead, which is being designated a foreign terrorist organization by the US, the UK, Israel, obviously, and the European Union. But within the signature of the Oslo Agreement in 1993 is between the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, is the PLO that turns the Palestinian Authority and is allowed to go back, to Jericho and Gaza to start its state-building efforts. I would love to introduce a little personal note here because it's a very young person working for the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs back then. I was asked several times to go and meet with Chairman Arafat in Tunis. The PLO had been exiled to Tunis from Lebanon. And Arafat was incredibly happy to see people going, many Europeans going there to systematically, willing to discuss what peace possible, in Palestine. And I always went back, with the feeling of having received a lot of information, with which I did absolutely nothing, and a lot of smiles and kisses on the face, and more likely photos, that enriched, my Mossad file. But Arafat was incredibly cheerful and always dressed in military uniform. And I was thinking, if President Trump today were to meet Yasser Arafat as President Clinton did in 1993, he would consider the beautiful, incredibly elegant Arafat's military uniform as a piece of haute couture in comparison with the much cooler outfit of President Zelensky these days. But I would prefer still, the much cooler, outfit of President Zelensky, I must admit. But so the PA was given administrative roles and a police force, and it could incrementally achieve the creation of a Palestinian state 5 years after, only if it proved to be actually successful and behave well, meaning not only in terms of governance, but also in terms of security, because many were the armed groups that were contrary to the Oslo Agreement, in particular Hamas, that continued to continue the armed struggles against Israelis and also the perpetration of terror attacks against Israeli civilians. But it wasn't Hamas that killed the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. It was the armed hand of a radical, ultra-nationalist, rightist activist who did it. And the year after that 1995 assassination, an Israeli anti-Oslo Likud politician, Benjamin Netanyahu, became Prime Minister. Neither Hamas nor Netanyahu has seriously endorsed a peace plan based on two-state solutions, meaning Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, as the UN Security Council Resolution 242 calls upon. In the Palestinian territories, the persistent bifurcation of the national movement into the PLO, PA, and Hamas has definitely impacted negatively on their pursuing a solution of the conflict. And all mediation efforts to bridge these two actors have miserably failed. These two Palestinian actors diverged not only on ideology, but also on the strategy to achieve the state. The PLO pursues the creation of a secular state of Palestine through diplomatic means, but it has dramatically failed in securing a state and in protecting the population from land confiscation, denial of rights, and violence perpetrated by both the Israeli army, IDF, and the settlers. I witnessed myself Palestinian anger at Israeli tanks getting into West Bank villages and disrupting, the moments of tea and relaxation of these Palestinian families at dawn. Finally, a little bit of breeze coming to the gardens of their little houses, and yet the presence of these tanks intimidating, to really use violence if we were not all back home and decide, to fold, the little, preparation for tea and go back home. But the fear and the anger at the same time, it's something that has remained within me. Also because I witnessed the same anger and humiliation when I was in Baghdad. Sandra mentioned that I was there as a national dialogue practitioner in an impossible situation during and after the Iraqi civil war of 2006 and 2007. And I really was with my Iraqi interlocutors crossing impossible checkpoints and feeling their humiliation and rage at very young, inexperienced American soldiers with rifles in their hands who could really decide their life and death. And they did, actually. In 2007, there was a massacre of 17 Iraqi civilians in a Baghdad square called the Nisur Square that was perpetrated by private security contractors, American private security contractors, who were pardoned all by President Trump in 2020. And the humiliation and the rage that came out, from that event and crossed the room where I was trying so desperately to keep, my Iraqi interlocutors focused on the way to end their civil war and move to a common vision for reconstructing the country was unfortunately derailed by the rage and humiliation at this military occupation. So when we speak about military occupation, unfortunately, we can never be so light, because when we witness, the effects and the impact on people, psychology, moods, and vision of the world, then we realize why sometimes we assist at radicalization instead of de-radicalization of populations under military occupation. But let's go back to Hamas. It aims at achieving an Islamic state through violence, meaning through armed struggles. And after its victory at the first and last Palestinian political elections in 2006 and the civil war that followed, Hamas has been governing Gaza under an intermittent Egyptian and Israeli siege, while the West Bank has been under the administrative control, but not the security one, of the West Bank. Now, please look at the map. The map? Yes. Okay, this map is very important for me because, it shows how Oslo, in a way, pushed away, the possibility for Palestinians to build a viable state. Oslo divided the West Bank, this is only the West Bank, divided the West Bank in 3 areas. There remains actually the division of the West Bank until today. You can see these dark orange colors. That is they are the only territories where the PA, so the Palestinian Authority, exercise a full administrative and security control. The pale yellow areas are called Area B, and is where the Palestinian Authority exercise administrative control, but shares the security control with the Israeli army. The Area C is all that area in gray that constitutes 60% of the West Bank. It is under the full administrative and military control of the IDF, the Israeli army, and Palestinians are restricted, so the access of Palestinians to this area is heavily restricted. The Area C is where the bulk of the settlers and settlements are in the West Bank. There are now around 450,000 settlers living in the West Bank, and in particular in this Area C. And you can see how, really the creation of a Palestinian state under these conditions, and I haven't put here the illegal settlements and military outposts that have been created since Oslo in the West Bank. Oslo, in fact, has been very negatively perceived by the Palestinians because in the end they could never stop the process of expansion and creation of new settlements in what would have been a Palestinian independent state. So Oslo did not provide a state for the Palestinians. It did not provide peace for the Israelis either. It exacerbated the power imbalance between Israel and the PA, both in the asymmetric negotiation process and on the ground. It's true the PA got a little bit of a flavor of administering its little territories that they could administer fully, but the Israelis continue to control the West Bank while relinquishing any responsibility and any cost of what would have been if they had not signed the Oslo Agreement, meaning if they had been seen still as occupier of the West Bank. So, as I was saying, the Jewish state has continued, no matter how, to expand the colonies and to build new ones. Settlements are illegal under the international law. But Israel has also suspended work permits for Palestinians working in Israel, and it has withheld tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority. An enormous complex of barriers and checkpoints hindered the movement of Palestinians within the West Bank and between the West Bank and the rest of the world, thus impacting incredibly negatively on the Palestinian economy. And now the war in Gaza has turned an already tense situation into an explosive one. The Israeli Defense Forces have reoccupied the northern, there is no more the map there, but yes, the northern part of the West Bank, in particular the refugee camps of Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarem. There has been really very violent clashes there between, the Israeli Defense Forces and these armed groups that Israel identifies as Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and obviously the bad, long, hidden hands of the Iranians. The Palestinian police has been unable to subdue this revolt in the camps, and unavoidably, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, continues to be seen as totally ineffective for Israelis and corrupt and unfortunately also despotic for many Palestinians too. The destruction of the camps and the dispersion of tens of thousands of refugees, together with the near collapse of the Palestinian Authority, is now throwing a very dark shadow over the future of the West Bank. The Israeli ultranationalist and religious government of Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't conceal its desire to integrate, so to annex this area, maybe with the support, eventually, of the American President, Donald Trump. But Trump has not told us yet what he wants to do with the West Bank. He was supposed to tell us after, the beginning of March. It's taking some time. We hope that his decision will be wise. But if the situation in the West Bank remains tense, the temporary truce in Gaza risks also collapsing. You have heard the latest, the negotiations basically have got again to a standstill. There is nothing that moves there. Netanyahu wants to resume the war with or without the release of hostages. Hamas does relinquish them. He wants the Israeli army out of Gaza. But unfortunately, this war in Gaza is the most lethal and the most destructive that has been fought in Gaza since 2008. The Palestinian victims are over 50,000, and the cost of the reconstruction is estimated to be around $50 billion. Over a period of time that for the Arab countries should be around 3 to 5 years, but for the American Special Envoy for the Middle East, Witkoff, should take around 10, 15 years. So we don't know exactly how long it will take. But the latest diplomatic plan that the Arab states have approved in Cairo shows that it is possible, after all, to reconstruct Gaza in 5 years, and to do it gradually so as not to push the Palestinian people away, as the Riviera plan, on the contrary, demands. But after 17 months of war, 2 ceasefires, a few failed attempts to end the war and imagine a post-war situation in Gaza, why is peace so elusive? I believe that the answer is to be found in the maximalistic objectives that the 2 sides have fixed while moving to war. After the shock of the terrorist attack, the government of Bibi Netanyahu has called for the release of all the hostages, the total destruction of Hamas, the demilitarization of the Strip, and the de-radicalization of the Palestinians. The Israeli government and the parliament, the Knesset, are adamantly against the creation of an independent Palestinian state. What does Hamas want? Hamas has demanded the end of the siege, the full withdrawal of the Israeli army from Gaza and the West Bank, so Gaza and the West Bank, the creation of a Palestinian state, the liberation of all Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, the reconstruction of the Strip, and the amelioration of the socio-economic conditions of the Palestinian populations. What does finally Hamas want is to remain relevant, to survive after this fifth war against Israel, and not only to survive as a political movement, but wants to survive as an armed one too. The struggle will continue. So if these are the two maximalist positions of both Israel and Hamas, and if the two sides do not compromise, which shows that they are not really going to compromise, unfortunately, all attempts to achieve peace will fail. And the real peace, which I said at the beginning, is the creation of a new order better than the previous one, will simply be an empty slogan. A look at where we stand on Gaza shows that the two sides have really only partially achieved their objectives. Hamas, as for the Israeli objectives, Hamas is weakened but not annihilated. Its military arsenal and infrastructures have been destroyed but not fully destroyed. Tunnels seem still to be there. They haven't been all blown up. It has not released all the hostages, and it would probably relinquish the administration of Gaza only to an independent Palestinian committee while keeping its weapons and recruiting new fighters. It demands also that all post-war arrangements be done with a Palestinian consensus. But if we ever question ourselves, what do Gazans want? Well, it seems the two pollsters, went to Gaza and actually asked, under terrible circumstances, what do Gazans want? And the majority of them came out saying they're still very much keen of identifying themselves with their land, with their faith, and with the struggle against the military occupation. In the absence of any Israeli post-war planning, Hamas, willy-nilly, has become the only alternative by default. And as for Hamas objectives, what did Hamas achieve after 17 months of war, the destruction of the Strip, the displacement of its population, the possibility that they will be thrown somewhere, maybe in between Egypt, Gaza, Saudi Arabia, maybe the sea, we don't know. Well, Hamas is still there. And as a military Islamist movement, its survival is already, in a way, a victory. So the Israeli army, though, has deepened its control over the Gaza Strip and continues to occupy the Philadelphia corridor that is along the border between Egypt and Gaza, and through which Israelis assumes have passed the smuggling of weapons, funds, and soldiers that fed the 7 October massacres in southern Israel. So the October massacre and the war has also swept the very already thin commitment of Israel towards the creation of an independent Palestinian state, and has swept off the Israeli trust in peace with the Palestinians. The government of Bibi Netanyahu stands also ready to resume war, even before the hostages are released. But the American-Hamas direct negotiations of the latest days have, in a way, contradicted, Benjamin Netanyahu's desiderata, as that complicated, definitely, his own calculations. The direct negotiations with the Americans may, in fact, have strengthened Hamas and offer it an official recognition, as Trump had already offered the Taliban in Afghanistan before 2020, thus making an official recognition of Hamas possible. Less compelling is indirect talks with Israelis and its reconciliation with the Palestinian Authority. So these direct American-Hamas negotiations may have given Hamas another score in its victory path. But which victory when we turn our attention into Gaza and the latest American proposal of turning it into a Riviera, after the expulsion of all its inhabitants and the denial of the rights of return. Egypt and Jordan, the only two Arab states to have signed a peace treaty with Israel, are particularly threatened by such a proposal, because that could heavily destabilize not only their borders, both in case of Egypt with Gaza and in case of the Jordanians with the West Bank, but could also bring these huge waves of Palestinian refugees within their borders. Even more threatening is the fact that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Trump has anyway cancelled, decades-old American tradition of supporting the two-state solutions, but it seems, that he doesn't want even to think about. But they have not even dared to know or to let the world know what they intend to do with the millions of Palestinians who do not want to migrate. Now, we know that Trump will easily get rid of 1.2 million Gazans from Gaza, but what will he do with the 3.3 million in the West Bank? Especially if they don't want to move, as the poll in Gaza has already shown, despite the dramatic conditions that the war has brought Gaza into. So what will President Trump do? Will he give the possibility to this Israeli government to partially annex the West Bank? But if there is a partial annexation, again, the Palestinians will have to have a very limited administration of a very limited patches of land that are very unconnected or disconnected, between and among themselves, and with Palestinians with very little rights. Which kind of peace are we going to achieve under these conditions? Even worse, if there is a full annexation of the West Bank, because this means that Israel will risk losing either the Jewishness of its state or its democratic credentials. So in both scenarios, peace is going to be unachievable. Trump's proposal, despite the craziness and the originality of such a proposal, has not provoked something positive. Finally, the Arab world has come out with its own post-war plan, focused on ending the war and reconstructing the Gaza Strip without kicking out the 1.2 million Palestinians in there. But the peace plan, unfortunately, didn't fly high, meaning was dead the moment it was pronounced in the room of the Arab League headquarters in Cairo, because both President Trump administration and the government of Bibi Netanyahu rejected it as being too lenient to Hamas, meaning not calling for the destruction of the Islamist movement, but on the contrary, giving the possibility to promote a kind of peace-building process in Gaza with a peacekeeping component, always in Gaza, that would be run by an independent committee of Palestinians. They, in the end, refers to the PA in the West Bank, but doesn't say what will happen to the weapons of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. So it's a no-go for Israel. But miraculously, the Europeans, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Italy approved the plan, supported it officially, and this is the second rift with the American administration of President Trump after the Ukrainian one, because the Europeans consider the plan as a good basis actually for negotiations. By moving towards the gradual reconstruction of the Palestinian territories and the strengthening of the Palestinian Authority into these territories, they will have in the end that Israel withdraws its forces from both the West Bank and Gaza and finally give way to the creation of a Palestinian state. Thus, basically, depriving Hamas of its raison d'etre and of its weapons. But the Gaza war has not been the only war. It has opened a multi-front war between Israel and the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi in Yemen, and the factions in Iraq. The Houthi in particular have also shaken the international trade through the Bab el-Mandeb to the Suez Canal by deviating it by half. Determined to end all threats along its borders and to promote a new era of peace and stability in the Middle East, Israel has won its military battles, but it risks pushing the prospect of peace further away. Its transformative objective is as ambitious as the one, I don't know if you remember, George W. Bush in 2003 while invading Iraq. The American president accompanied that invasion with the stated objective of getting rid of a dictator, Saddam Hussein, in order to turn Iraq into a beacon of democracy that would enlighten the entire Middle East. Well, the effect of that invasion had been all but peace and stability. Iraq went through a violent insurgency, followed by an even more violent civil war, followed by the horrific transformation of that insurgency into an Islamic State, and was finally routed in an international war against that Islamic State in 2014-17. Iraq has not become a beacon of democracy, and the Middle East definitely not an area of peace. But will Israel succeed where the Americans failed? Will Israel put in place an Israel-led order, a kind of Israeli pax that would definitely bring stability to this area? I doubt. Israel has scored positively in the battlefield. It has killed the political and military leadership of Hezbollah and 2/3 of its military arsenal. It has also neutralized the Iraqi factions. With the help also of the US and the UK air forces, has inflicted material damages to the Houthi in Yemen. The collapse of the Assad regime that was due by different sources, different causes, but also indirectly the fact, that Israel weakened, the major external sponsor of the Assad regime, mainly the Iranians, has also deprived Hezbollah and Iran itself of their most crucial ally in the region. And yet, even if the Israeli expansion into hills in southern Lebanon, as well as in the Golan Heights in Syria, could be eventually justified by the necessity of securing its borders, over the long term, this territorial expansion might risk of making tensions even more acute. And in fact, it's the new president of Lebanon, the General Aoun, who clearly denounced the Israeli territorial expansions when he said, and I quote, "With the emergence of technologies, drones and satellites, an army doesn't need a hill for surveillance." And now I would love to have the second map shown to you, which is the one of Syria. So we get into another easy subject, which is the very complex geopolitical situation of Syria in the aftermath of the collapse of the Assad regime in Damascus. I would love to briefly tell you, it's a very colored map, but it shows how fragmented still the Syria situation is on the ground, with Druze, you see this purple area in the south, and opposition armed groups always in the south, closer to the Golan Heights, which is the green area. All the gray areas is where the actually new authorities in Damascus, the ex-Qaeda Islamist movement and armed group called Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, finally has controlled over this, obviously the so-called, useful Syria, because it's the main road access that the links the north with the south of the country and the main urban centers in Syria. But you can see that within that gray area, there is a very pale pink area, is where still the insurgency is active, meaning all the elements, armed elements of the old regime still fights the new army of the new ruler of Damascus. And if we go further up north, this orange area is where the Syrian National Army, which is supported by Turkey, has been fighting, but actually stopped fighting only 2 days ago, against the Kurdish Syrian forces of the YPG, which is this very pale yellow area in the northeast. This very pale yellow area is a very crucial, important geopolitical territory for any Damascus government to acquire, because it's 30% of the land with most of the energy resources of Syria, and the YPG, meaning the Syrian Kurdish militia, being around now 100,000 within the Syrian Democratic Forces that have been set up by the Americans in an anti-ISIS posture. The white areas is a white area. They are still, purely Qaeda and ISIS, groups moving there. While this little tiny thing that you see at Tanf with a little US flag is where definitely it's a deconflicting zone between Syria and Jordan. So they have controlled, that very long stretch of territory. So this is where we stand in Syria today. But Israel, in an effort to protect its northern border, has occupied the Golan Heights, meaning the buffer zone between the occupied Syrian Golan Heights and the Syrian Golan Heights, even pushing itself further up to Mount Hermon, which is literally 40 kilometers away from Damascus. And the Israeli defense minister doesn't stop reminding the new authorities in Damascus that if Eshara, the new president of Syria, opens the door of the presidential palace, can actually wave the Israeli military settlements up in Mount Hermon. So definitely, a big thing to digest for the new authorities in Damascus, the risk being the risk of losing their credibility if they do not actually exercise control over the borders of the country by losing also the sovereignty over the entire territory. So the risk of this Israeli expansion into Syria in an radical Islamist posture may risk over the short and medium term to create more tensions than actually smoothing them down. Also, to increase tensions is the latest Israeli willingness to protect the Druze. You remember that little purple areas in southern Syria? Well, the Druze are not only there, but they're only very much in the outskirts of Damascus. So Israel has offered to protect the Druze community. They revolted initially against the possibility of relinquish the weapons to the new authorities, but it seems that only yesterday the new authorities in Damascus have stretched the hands to the Druze community as well, as they did to the Kurdish in the north. But this involvement of Israel into minority issues risk really creating more troubles than solving them. To give you an idea about how sensitive is the issue of minorities in the Middle East, I want to refer to you an episode when I was director at the United Nations. I helped, coordinate, the United Nations is a huge bureaucracy. So before doing anything outside, we need to coordinate the huge machinery inside. So I was tasked to coordinate the UN support for a French-Jordanian conference in defense of minorities, namely the Christians and the Yazidis in Syria and Iraq, exposed to the wrath of the Islamic states all through the 2014-2017 years. The conference produced a very detailed action plan, few meetings, and then it faded away not even 3 years later. During my last official visit to Lalesh, which is the sacred territory of the Yazidis in the autonomous Kurdish region of Iraq, I could perceive the despair of a community deeply wounded not only by the violence, and it was horrible violence, perpetrated by ISIS against mainly their women and children, but also by the negligence of the international community. The recent massacre of Alawites along the Syrian coast, you remember that pale pink area? Well, there, as well as the Druze rebellion in southern Syria, may serve as a reminder of how vulnerable minorities continue to be. A century ago, European colonial powers used to intervene in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire on the basis of protecting ethnic and religious minorities. Israelis' protection of the Druze is seen in this region, and because of this long history, fomenting divisions rather than fostering peace. Furthermore, the contemporary heir of that Ottoman Empire, meaning the Turkish Republic, is today the biggest ally of the new Islamist authorities in Damascus. Any Israeli action that affects the rule negatively will surely meet a strong Turkish reaction. Turkey will be also tough at Iran if ever the Islamic Republic tries to reactivate armed groups that could further destabilize the Arab country. Syria thus becomes a potential hotspot in the Israel-Turkey and Turkey-Iran relations. And we have seen that along the coast, the war continues between the remnants of the old regimes and the forces of the new one. The YPG I mentioned to you, the Syrian Kurdish armed groups that Turkey accused of being linked to the terrorist movement of the PKK, have recently actually concluded an agreement with Damascus. And this is an only very good positive signal in this very complex situation. So Damascus and the Kurds have agreed no more war, but only integration of all the administrative and military structures of that northeastern part of Syria into the new government of Damascus. And this seems to have been facilitated by a strong American diplomatic support. On an even more positive note, finally, we can also say, the Kurdish separatist guerrilla seems to be fading away in Turkey. Its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, has asked the PKK to disband and disarm in exchange of his release from prison and some yet-to-be-defined rights for the Kurds. Confined, though, to the Kindil Mountains, the PKK has been, however, mainly operative from Iraq, where it has successfully helped the Yazidi communities fight against ISIS in 2014-17. But the presence of the PKK and the international war against ISIS has pushed Turkey to build military bases in Iraq in an anti-PKK but also anti-ISIS functions. And today, with this offer by the leader of the PKK to dismantle the militias, we don't know yet the future of this armed group in Iraq, even though the Iraqi government has already considered the group unwelcome. And now let me go to Iraq briefly. I hope you can still be with me. So, after the fall of Saddam Hussein regime and the American occupation of the country in 2003, Iraq witnessed an insurgency and a bloody civil war. They paved the way to Iran to actually start to become, and the most influential political, economic, and security partner of the new post-2003 Iraq. In fact, Tehran plays the most influential role in the affairs of this country at the expenses of the American occupiers. America, in fact, withdrew mainly from Iraq in 2011 by keeping only few thousand elements in the country in an anti-ISIS posture. But they're bound all to dismount next year. But Iran has become also an important market for Iranian products, especially in Iran under heavy sanctions regimes, as well as the top religious destinations for Iranian pilgrims. But in Iraq, as in Lebanon and Syria, Iran's influence has grown thanks to the weakness of the state and its institutions, and to the fragmentations of societies due to sectarian tensions, discriminations, uneven distribution of resources, and civil conflict. Iran has also funded and trained the anti-Israeli axis of resistance, thus projecting force along the border with its enemy, Israel, and protecting itself from Israelis' direct attack. But the war in Gaza has shown the weakness of the Iranian strategy as well, since the Israeli bombardments has not only weakened Hezbollah, but it's weakened also the Iranian aerial capabilities and missiles productions as well. So the red line between the two countries, Iran and Israel, have been dramatically broken. And a possible direct Israeli strike against its nuclear capability becoming even closer. American additional sanctions and Israeli threats have also hardened Tehran positions, opening the way to a dangerous conflict that has the potential to drag the entire Middle East into war. President Trump agrees with PM Netanyahu about the grave danger Iran and its soon-to-be nuclear bomb represent to the world peace. He has relaunched the maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic with the aim of changing its destabilizing regional behavior and stopping its nuclear weaponization. By doing so, Trump plans to succeed where his predecessor, Joe Biden, failed. This is also one of the features of the American foreign policy of President Trump, making sure that he is the anti-Biden. So Biden has been considered and accused to be weak vis-à-vis the Iranians because he was ready to defreeze $10 billion in assets to the Iranians in exchange of the liberation of American in the Iranian prisons. Biden seems also to have been ready to return to the negotiations on the nuclear deal with Iran. It is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, from which the Trump administration had unilaterally withdrawn in 2018. But the overall Biden-Iranian negotiations stopped on October 7, when Hamas attacked and committed the terror attack against Israeli civilians in southern Israel. But despite its ideological commitment, Iran has also shown pragmatism over the years. And already 40 years ago, it was the founder and the ideologue of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Imam Khomeini, who, after the bloody conflict with the arch-enemy Saddam Hussein in Iraq had reached an impossible standstill, decided to give up the battle and to sign a ceasefire agreement in 1988. A peace treaty was signed with Iraq a year after the death of Imam Khomeini in 1990. And pragmatism shows also the new president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, who was elected on the basis of its electoral program of internal reforms and dialogue with the West. At the beginning, the West meant also the United States. Today, I think, unfortunately, that dialogue is over, or it seems so. This dialogue, though, is crucial for Tehran to break the cycle of international sanctions and to give the country a chance to recover from a deep economic and financial crisis. But the international community has until the end of October to decide whether or not to reinstate the entire package of sanctions against Tehran that had been suspended with the signature of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. That deal was turned into a United Security Council resolution in 2015 and became Resolution 2231. I was there in the room of the Security Council. It seemed to be finally we were ready to turn a page, to impress something new in the Middle East that would have paved the way to the detente with Iran, absorbing it into the international community, making sure they could become a member of a peace search rather than an element of disturb and tensions in the regions. So there was a lot of excitement and a lot of pride to have come out finally with something important. And yet, unfortunately, the negotiations had not been involving part of the Arab countries in the region who were back then engaged in wars in the region, which they accused Iranians fomenting them. And in particular, the Yemeni civil war in 2015, when Saudi Arabia organized, a coalition to move against the Houthi in Yemen in support of the officially recognized Yemeni government. And there was still the Syria war and the intervention of the military interventions of Russia in the civil war in order to protect the Assad regime. So there was a lot going on there, and the Arabs felt that that agreement, that resolution, was actually rewarding Iran without putting the finger into its destabilizing behavior in the region. So Israel was not alone back then at opposing to that deal. And President Trump finally withdrew from it in 2018. But years later, it is still unclear whether Trump is ready to offer a credible negotiations path to the Iranians, or is instead pursuing military strikes against their nuclear program. His letter to the maximum authority in Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has just been rejected. And Khamenei, I quote what he said, doesn't want to deal with bullying governments who insist on negotiations not to resolve issues, but to impose. Whom do you think the bullying government is? Despite this harsh rhetoric, are negotiations still possible? Or else, will Trump green the green light to the Israelis to attack the Iranian nuclear sites? And what will the Iranian reactions be now that it is perceived weakened militarily and, according to some analysts, actually on the point of regime change? As for the Arab countries, they have chosen detente with Iran, despite the harsh rhetoric of the Emiratis and the Saudis against the Iranian Republic. They have all turned the page. And actually, the Saudis have reestablished their diplomatic relations with Iran that had been broken since 2016, and this thanks to a Chinese mediation activity. Also, Egypt. And you would be mad, why are you mentioning Egypt with Iranians? Because actually Egypt is engaged in a very delicate process of reconciliation with the Iranians, with whom the Egyptians had reached a nadir in their relations after the assassin of President Anwar Sadat was given and was dedicated a street in Tehran in his name. This a year after, obviously, the assassination of Anwar Sadat, who had just given state funerals to the deposed, ousted, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Cairo, and had signed 3 years 3 years after the treaty with Israel. My student years in Cairo were full of stories of friends and their family members who had sacrificed their youth when not their lives in the wars against Israel. What would the Iranians know about these wars? I kept hearing from them. But now Israel and Iran are very close to moving war against each other. They have exchanged direct bombardments twice already. One in April, after Israel killed Iranian officials in Damascus and destroyed some of the Iranian military installations in the country. And again in September, after the Israeli assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, their main crucial ally in the region. But also Iran has been weakened after these strikes politically and militarily. So what is happening with the weakening of Iran, the weakening of its partners and proxies, the end of the Assad regime in Damascus? So would this lead the way to peace, or on the contrary, increments tension and bring the entire region again into war? A weakened Iran, threatened by US and Israeli strikes, has already accelerated its nuclear weaponization program, according to the UN nuclear watchdog. And it could bring other countries in the region to follow its path. Iran could also hinder the flow of hydrocarbons in the Persian Gulf and raise the price of oil, thus impacting negatively on the economy of the world. Iran could still destabilize Iraq, and it could reignite tensions in Yemen and Syria, and shake the stability of the Arab Peninsula and the entire Middle East. So the Middle East is again at a dangerous crossroads. It is on the brink of a war, while offering, though, chances for peace. But peace is possible if it is a just and comprehensive process, still based on values and rights. Allow me a little touch of United Nations past. President Trump, after all, has declared that he wants to end all wars and prevent new ones. But his peace comes with strength, which is the threat to use force against state and non-state actors who do not agree quickly with these deals. He may or he may not succeed in ending and avoiding wars, but peace, the one that creates a new order better than the old one, can only come through an inclusive and holistic process that requires calm. This process should tackle the deep-rooted causes of tensions in the region and include governments and citizens alike. At the country level, it should promote the reform and the consolidation of state institutions so as to make them more responsive to human rights, democratic representation, and equal distribution of resources. It should develop an all-encompassing national dialogue, the respective of the ethnic and religious diversities of society will help both state and society emancipate from identity politics and external interferences by shaping a common vision for the country. At the regional level, it should involve the just resolution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict based on the recognition and the security of the former, but also the self-determination and the sovereignty of the latter. It should support the broader normalization with Israel and the detente with Iran. It should implement regional and international programs and projects that favor integration over disintegration and cooperation over competition. It should also mobilize the international community in joining the regional efforts of reconstruction of the countries badly damaged by the wars. Finally, it should involve citizens and foster their mutual understanding and acceptance, because ultimately it's only they, the citizens, who can truly turn old enemies into new friends, thus making peace a long-term political success. I thank you for your attention and patience. Bravi! Bravi! I'm at your disposal. Kill me. Whatever you want to do, do.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions? Est-ce que vous avez des questions, messieurs, dames?
Hello. I certainly appreciated the analysis that you did. Obviously, this is a professional analysis of everything there, too. The issue that I'm looking for over here is that, at least from a very small area of looking at it, not being political about it, is that all of these regimes are looking for a self-preservation. You know, look at Iran, look at Iraq, look at every one of them is doing the same thing over there. And in particular, Saudi Arabia and the Emirate countries, because essentially by self-preservation, they're trying to also help the, let's say, religious side of the Wahhabis and everybody else in this area, which is causing a lot of havoc all over. So the solution is, I understand what you're saying, there is no solution for that stuff, but as long as the self-preservation, you know, is fueled by anything, that's a big problem. Second issue is the lack of a leadership in the world. So right now, Trump is becoming the default leader of the world. Nobody's saying anything about it by bullying or by whatever ways that is going to do that. So what is the solution? How can some of these things go in a way that it is going to find a solution? The Palestinian issues are totally disappeared. They don't exist. Really. I mean, that's the main issue.
Thanks to Hamas is back, I mean, into
that's
the
right.
world
But at
agenda.
the same time, there's another question that I'm sure you have looked at it too. The attack of October 7, is it really something that Israeli fell asleep and kind of let him do that? Or it was really planned and everything else? I personally don't believe that Hamas has such a planning kind of capacity that they were strong in certain area, but they wanted to self-preserve also. That was the issue in there too. So, you know, Israel, obviously the current regime is trying to self-protect and promoting these kind of things in there. So the question over here is really, you know, that fits his agenda for surviving, number one, and at the same time, create a havoc all over the world. They always wanted to have, also they wanted to have sorry, I just wanted
No, if you want, you can come here.
No,
and
no,
I
no.
go there.
Absolutely not.
Why not? Why not? Come on.
Yeah. The question
We
over
can
here
do.
in light of all of this, and you have been to a lot of these meetings, what is the solution that you have seen among all of these leaders that are in the UN or in other places? That was
Well, the UN is an organization made of states, despite the fact that its charter, you know, starts with we, the people. But in the end of the day, we assume the governments are freely elected, you know, by the people and do represent, you know, their will. But what you said is true. I mean, we are witnessing, you know, a lot of internal turmoil because, I mean, many of these governments, you know, are struggling to keep, you know, actually their power in place. But I think, I mean, that they have learned, some of them have learned a lesson. And one of the lessons is strengthening the social cohesion of their society, because they have understood that when, you know, a society is broken, everybody else in the region and outside the region will put the fingers into that, exacerbating tensions, bringing, you know, the tensions into the brink, if not the civil war. So I'm thinking about the Egyptians who finally have given room to a national dialogue. How serious that process is going to be, we will see. And anyway, it's going very smoothly, opening up, I mean, to even, some very delicate subjects like laws, for instance, or the creation of law, the production of laws. But also Saudi Arabia, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, this new ruler obviously is not a beacon of democracy, but in the end is actually pushing the country to become more open to the world by sidelining, the radical religious elements that had been so powerful, rooted in the country. So there is a positive wave of transformation within these same countries, reason why nobody wants war. They are all busy on implementing their long-term national visions, so they call it 2030, 2040, 2050, but that is what, actually is happening in this part of the world, and I think this is the reason why no one wants war. And President Trump, you mentioned, doesn't want war. And I said, actually he's in a hurry to stop Netanyahu from re-entering war, because his main objective, as I said, is, okay, let's stop, this endless war, because he's really is in a hurry to ending it, but wants to give room to the normalization process that he had started with the Abraham Accords and wants to extend, to Saudi Arabia. So I think never to underestimate, obviously, what is happening inside each of these countries, despite the fact that they're not full-fledged democratic systems, but they are trying actually to implement those kind of reforms necessary to pave the way to better times. I'm hopefully, optimistic, but obviously, as I said, we are still at the crossroads. So everything can go good, well, but everything can go terribly bad. So let's hope that, things will do good.